Evan slid the post-nup across the table and said, "Sign it, Alexis. Don't make this uglier than it needs to be." His voice was calm, almost bored, like he was asking me to pass the salt instead of handing over my life. The kitchen felt too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ribs. Even the refrigerator hum froze. I stared at him, at the man who once pretended to adore me, and felt something inside me shift slow and sharp. But what Evan didn't know was that I wasn't the one cornered. "Before I go any further, tell me where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you've ever trusted someone who turned out to be nothing like who they pretended to be, hit like and subscribe. You're not alone in that kind of betrayal, not even close." My name is Alexis Hartwell, and before everything collapsed, people used to describe my life as perfect. They saw the house, the studio, the polished routines, the quiet confidence I carried like a second skin. They never saw the cracks forming beneath it, the kind that only show when you're alone in a dim kitchen, staring at a man who's preparing to take everything from you. But to understand how I ended up there, with the pen shaking in my hand, you'd have to go back to the beginning. Not just the beginning with Evan, but the beginning of the ways I learned to swallow things that hurt. I met Evan at an art exhibition downtown, one of those cavernous converted warehouses filled with abstract pieces that looked like someone spilled thoughts across canvas. I remember the hum of the crowd, the soft amber light bouncing off concrete floors, the faint smell of paint and champagne. He came up beside me while I was studying a piece, a blur of blue strokes, and said, "You know the artist used repetition to express emotional paralysis." His voice was smooth, confident. I later learned he had no idea what he was talking about, but that night it sounded convincing. We talked for an hour. He asked questions like he was peeling back layers, smiling every time I said something personal. That was his first game, curiosity disguised as intimacy. I was lonely enough to accept it. 3 months later, I was flying to Santa Fe with him, wandering through desert markets, drinking 2 strong margaritas. He sent flowers to my studio. He cooked dinners twice a week. He listened, or pretended to. I didn't know then, but it would come back to haunt me. The shift happened after he moved into the Hartwell house. It was a gradual erosion, like water quietly wearing down stone. At first it was small things. "You don't need to work so late," he'd say, flipping through magazines on the couch. Or, "Your assistants can handle that. You shouldn't be so controlling." Little comments that didn't feel like comments until they stacked up. Then came the bigger things. He stopped looking for work. He started buying expensive sneakers because they were on sale. He needed a break from job hunting. He used my credit card to surprise me with a watch he claimed he'd pay back later. He never did. His family didn't help. The first time I met Madeline, his mother, she walked through my home like an inspector hired to assess structural damage. She touched furniture, nodded at my art pieces, and said Evan always wanted a woman with taste. Like I was a decor item he acquired, not a partner. Kelly, his sister, was sharper. She eyed my car in the driveway and said, "Must be nice." She said it often, sometimes in different tones, but always with the same bitterness. Still, I ignored it. That's something I learned early. Growing up, attention in my household was a currency, and I never earned much of it. I was the daughter who ate quickly, so my mother wouldn't complain. The student who placed first, but stood alone at award ceremonies. The girl who worked double shifts at a diner every summer while my cousins spent vacations at the lake. I didn't know it then, but all that swallowing would shape the woman Evan thought he could break. The first real alarm bell came from Nora, my assistant. She walked into my office one rainy Thursday, her brow tight, holding a printed statement. "Alexis, did you buy a men's Rolex last week?" The rain outside hit the windows in hard, uneven taps. I looked at the amount. I tasted metal at the back of my tongue. I whispered no. Nora hesitated before saying, "Then I think we have a problem." I didn't know how large that problem was yet, but its shadow stretched far beyond a single purchase. I confronted Evan that night, the printed statement still warm from my hand. He was in the living room, sprawled across the couch, scrolling on his phone, with the TV buzzing behind him. The room smelled like buttered popcorn and the cheap cologne he sprayed too generously. I stood there for a moment, watching him laugh at something on the screen, and wondered how many versions of him existed. Because the one I met in that art gallery never would have charged a Rolex to my company card without blinking. "Did you buy a watch?" I asked. My voice was flat, too steady. He didn't look up. "Relax, Lex," he said, flicking his wrist as if brushing off a fly. "I'll pay you back." When I asked, "Soon," he said. "Don't make it a big deal." It was the ease in his tone that hit me. The entitlement, like my work, my money, my name Hartwell, were all things he could dip into without consequence. He didn't apologize. He didn't even pause the TV. I should have recognized the rot then, but I didn't. I was still trying to keep the peace, still clinging to the version of myself who could fix things by being patient. I didn't know it back then, but that moment would matter later. More signs followed, piling one on top of the other, like wet laundry you pretend you'll deal with tomorrow. Evan stayed out late and returned smelling like citrus body spray, the kind they use at gyms. He whispered in corners of the house when he thought I couldn't hear. He deleted messages quickly. He claimed his phone died more often. He borrowed my car and returned it with seats pushed back and fingerprints on the passenger window that weren't mine. Each detail lodged itself under my skin like splinters. Each one hurt more going in than coming out. Nora noticed too. She'd knock on my office door, her voice careful, asking if she should review certain expenses. She never pushed. She didn't have to. I saw the numbers myself. Dinners for two, at places Evan claimed he'd never been, hotel charges, an hour outside the city, supplements purchased at a gym I'd never heard him mention. The pattern formed before the truth did. Then came Derek Vaughn, the investigator Jordan recommended. He arrived at my studio one late afternoon in October, when the air smelled like cold metal and the sky dimmed early. Derek had a quiet presence, the kind that fills a room without demanding anything. He spread photos on my conference table. Evan at a hotel bar with a blonde woman in athletic leggings. Evan loading gym bags into my car. Evan handing cash to someone near a strip mall. And then the final picture, Evan holding hands with a woman outside a gym, his face lit by the neon sign above them, Brielle Summers. But that wasn't the worst of it. Derek slid a final folder toward me, heavier than the rest. "There's something else," he said. "Your husband isn't who he says he is." Inside the folder were documents, court filings, a driver's license, under a different name, an old mugshot. Evan was tied to a financial fraud case in another state. He'd left before the hearings. The charges were still open. The room spun. Not dramatically, not like in movies. It was more subtle, a slow tilting of the floor beneath me. I gripped the conference table and stared at the papers, feeling the weight of every decision that led me here. The desert trip, the dinners, the flowers, the way he'd called me his solid ground. I wondered whether anything he'd ever said to me was real. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. Instead, I felt an ache settle inside me, an ache so familiar I recognized it instantly. It was the same ache from childhood dinners where no one listened, from holidays spent being the afterthought, from years of working twice as hard for half the acknowledgement. But this time, something shifted. The ache didn't collapse me. It sharpened me, because now I knew the truth, and knowing it changed everything. After Derek left that evening, I sat alone in my studio with the folders spread open, like a wreckage I couldn't look away from. Outside, the streetlights flickered against the windows, and the faint hum of traffic drifted upward, like background noise to my unraveling. My hands felt cold. My heartbeat felt louder than the rain starting to fall. I kept staring at Evan's old mugshot. His eyes looked the same as they did when he asked me to trust him. Empty in all the wrong ways. I drove home slowly, the kind of slow where you're afraid of what waits on the other side of your front door. The Hartwell house sat quiet under the street lamp, looking steadier than I felt. Inside, the air smelled like reheated pizza, and the cologne Evan always sprayed too close to his neck. He was in the kitchen humming to himself while scraping crumbs off the counter. When he looked up, He gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're late," he said. "Everything okay?" I stared at him for a long moment and then answered, "Busy day." My voice sounded normal. It horrified me how normal it sounded. Maybe survival has its own tone. The escalation didn't begin with one big blowout. It began quietly the way storms creep over rooftops before lightning hits. Evan started taking bolder steps, small tests to see how much I'd tolerate. He used my card again this time for a $300 dinner at a sushi place he claimed he hated. He stayed out later, returning with a faint lipstick smudge he wiped away too slowly when he walked past me. He borrowed my Jeep without asking. When I confronted him, he laughed. "Relax, Lex," he said. "You're acting like my mother." It was the first time he used that tone. The tone men use when they've convinced themselves they're the victim of the woman feeding them. The next escalation came through Kelly. She showed up one afternoon while I was gardening in the backyard, the air thick with the smell of wet soil and fallen leaves. She stood over me with her arms crossed, holding a crumpled receipt. "You should probably see this," she said, "before you buy him another toy." The receipt showed a necklace rose gold, delicate engraved, purchased with Evan's personal card, but signed under my address, for Brielle. The faint bitterness in Kelly's voice told me she wasn't doing this out of kindness. She simply hated Brielle more than she hated me. I took the receipt without a word. Kelly smirked. "Must be fun," she said, "funding his midlife crisis." Her words dug into me, but not the way she expected. It wasn't the insult that hurt. It was the fact that she was right, and she knew it. Then came Madeline's interference. She called one evening while I was reviewing blueprints in my office, her voice pinched and cold. "Alexis, honey," she said, "Evan told me you've been difficult. Maybe if you weren't so controlling, he wouldn't feel the need to look elsewhere for comfort." I froze. "What did you just say?" "Oh, don't be dramatic," she replied. "Men stray when they're pushed away. You know how they are. I didn't push him anywhere, I said." Well, she sighed. "You work all the time. You barely cook. You barely entertain. A man needs to feel appreciated." The line crackled, though I wasn't sure whether it was the phone or something in me snapping. I hung up without saying goodbye. My hands shook as I set the phone down, but the shaking wasn't from hurt. It was from clarity. The next escalation arrived publicly. Brielle started posting videos online, subtle enough to seem innocent, but pointed enough that anyone paying attention could see the intention. A shot of her gym bag in the passenger seat of my Jeep. A mirror selfie with a caption, "Upgrading my lifestyle soon." A short clip of her blowing a kiss while saying, "When he finally chooses you." Her followers had no idea who he was, but I did. And Evan did. And Kelly sent me the links with texts like, "Get your boy." But the moment that carved itself into me happened at the country club. Evan invited me to join him for a casual drink, claiming he wanted to reconnect. I went. Part of me wanted to believe he still cared even a tiny bit. When I arrived, he was surrounded by 3 men laughing, loud enough to turn heads. I approached the table, and before I could speak, he said, "This is Alexis, my wife, for now." The men laughed. The bartender looked down. Evan smirked, lifting his glass. My cheeks burned, but not from embarrassment, from anger, from humiliation so sharp it felt like a blade pressed under my ribs. On the drive home, I kept my hand steady on the wheel even as my throat tightened. I didn't cry. I didn't breathe deeply. I just drove. Because if I didn't keep moving, something inside me would collapse. But the breaking point, the one that cracked something fundamental, came 2 nights later. Evan cornered me in the hallway, his breath thick with whiskey. He shoved the post-nup into my chest and said, "Sign it. You're becoming a problem." His voice was low, cold rehearsed, as if he'd practiced it. "You owe me," he added, "for everything I've put up with." Something inside me turned to iron. I didn't show it, not yet, but the shift was real, and he didn't even notice. He had no idea what was coming. The night he shoved the post-nup into my chest, something in me went perfectly still the way quiet settles over a lake right before a storm breaks. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stepped around him and walked into my office, closing the door slowly enough that the soft click sounded like a verdict. I sat there in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the whisper of the heater kicking on. I stared at the paperwork, feeling my pulse throb beneath my skin. Evan thought intimidation worked on me. He thought silence meant surrender. He had no idea silence was the sound of me sharpening. The next morning I woke up before sunrise, the house still wrapped in that heavy pre-dawn quiet. I made coffee, inhaling the burnt smell of the old machine Evan refused to replace, and scrolled through the bank transactions Nora had flagged. More dinners, more hotels, more careless footprints of a man who believed he'd never face consequences. It wasn't just betrayal, it was arrogance. The kind that grows when someone is certain you won't leave. Later that week, while I was loading presentation boards into my car, Mr. Hanson, our elderly neighbor, walked over with his slow, measured steps. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat before speaking. "Alexis," he said, "I probably shouldn't get involved, but I saw something the other night." My stomach tightened. "What did you see?" "A young woman," he said, "walking out of your house at midnight. Blonde, athletic build, didn't look like you." His voice held no judgment, only concern. But hearing it from someone outside my world made it real in a way the receipts and photos hadn't. I thanked him, forcing a smile that felt brittle. As he walked away, his silhouette framed against the autumn trees, I realized even the neighborhood knew more than they should. A few days after that, Kelly sent me a video. No context, no message, just a 30-second clip of Evan at a bar, his hand on Brielle's thigh, leaning in close as she laughed. My throat closed, not because of the betrayal I'd accepted that long ago, but because of the ease with which he lived his double life. Like he'd practiced it. When Evan came home that night, I watched him move around the kitchen as if nothing had changed. He opened the fridge, grabbed a beer, kicked the door shut with his heel. He didn't notice the way my eyes followed him. He didn't notice anything that didn't benefit him. "You're quiet lately," he said, taking a long drink. "Just tired," I answered. "You should take a break from work," he said. "Your stress is affecting me." That sentence lodged itself in my chest like a shard of glass. My stress was affecting him. My work was an inconvenience. My silence was an obstacle. It was stunning, really, how easily he weaponized my humanity. But things were still climbing. The next blow came during a family dinner at Madeleine's house, one of those uncomfortable gatherings filled with overcooked chicken judgmental stares and passive-aggressive small talk. The dining room smelled like floral candles and boiled vegetables. I sat across from Evan, who scrolled on his phone under the table. Madeleine glanced at me with that thin, tight smile she used whenever she wanted to scold me politely. "Evan tells me you've been moody," she said. "Does he?" I replied. Madeleine nodded, tilting her head. "Marriage requires sacrifice, Alexis. Maybe if you were softer with him, he wouldn't feel so distant." Kelly snorted. "Yeah, Alexis, be softer." Their eyes burned into me, waiting for a reaction. Evan didn't even look up. He just smirked. Something inside me twisted. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if everyone was leaning closer, trying to peel away whatever strength I had left. I excused myself and walked to the bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink until my knuckles went pale. The mirror reflected a woman I barely recognized, her jaw tight, her eyes sharper than ever. That was the moment I understood that none of them, not Evan, not his family, had ever seen me as a partner. I was a resource, a convenience, a wallet. And then came the moment that propelled everything toward the breaking point. Evan decided to host a poker night at our house, claiming he needed a guys' night. I came home from a late meeting to find empty beer bottles on the counter, chip crumbs ground into the rug, and strangers sprawled on my furniture. The house smelled like sweat-stale beer and cheap cigars. Evan was at the dining table shouting at someone about a lost hand. When he saw me, he waved a dismissive hand. "Relax," he said. "We're celebrating." For what I asked. He grinned. "My life's about to get a whole lot easier." His friends laughed, raising their glasses. One of them muttered, "Man's leveling up." I stood there, surrounded by noise and arrogance and the thick stench of entitlement. My breathing slowed. My heart steadied. It was strange how the more they laughed, the calmer I became, like the storm inside me was aligning perfectly. Later that night, after everyone left, Evan cornered me again. He shoved the post-nup into my hands. "Sign it tomorrow," he said. "I'm done waiting." He had no idea that waiting was no longer his choice. The night everything detonated didn't start with thunder. It started with laughter, the loud, sloppy kind that spills out of people who think they've already won. I watched it all from the safety of my hotel suite at the Rosemont Grand, the city lights flickering below me like 1,000 small witnesses. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. Another alert from the smart home system, another sign that Evan believed he ruled my house now. I opened the app. The camera feed loaded in crisp clarity. My living room was unrecognizable. Music pounded through the speakers, lights flashing in chaotic bursts. Dozens of bodies filled the space, strangers mostly. People Evan had no business bringing into a home built on precision and intention. Brielle danced in the middle of the room, wearing one of my silk robes, the belt dragging behind her like a taunt. Evan stepped into frame, sweaty, flushed with liquor and ego. He grabbed a bottle of wine, my wine, from the shelf. A vintage Cabernet I'd saved for a special project launch. He didn't pour it carefully. He tipped it back like a frat boy chugging cheap vodka. Red dripped down his chin, staining his shirt. He turned toward the phone he had propped on a stack of my architecture books and tapped the screen. He was live streaming to the world. "Look at this!" He shouted, arms wide, voice booming. "Hartwell Estate is officially under new management." The crowd cheered. Brielle giggled, wrapping herself around him. I leaned forward on the sofa, the breath leaving my chest in a slow, controlled stream. Not from hurt. Not anymore. Not for him. But from the perfect stupidity of it all. This was evidence, gift-wrapped and served hot. Evan held the camera up to his face. His pupils were blown wide, intoxication and arrogance blending into one ugly expression. "My wife, well, ex-wife, soon couldn't handle success," he said. "She's too old, too controlling, too scared to live. But me, I'll turn this place into something real." He stumbled backward, knocking over one of my sculptures. It shattered on the floor. I blinked. Not in shock, just marking the moment. He lifted the phone again. "Say hi, baby." Brielle leaned in, lips pouty, eyes glassy. "We're moving in tomorrow," she chirped. "This house is mine, ours." Evan said so. Another crash. More laughter. A toast to upgrading. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just pressed the record option on my end of the smart home app, saving the stream directly to the cloud. A notification popped up immediately. Jordan had joined the live feed I shared with her earlier. Seconds later, a message from her appeared on my screen. "Already forwarding to the police. Stay exactly where you are." I smiled, cold, small, quiet. Then I went to work. I opened the smart home master controls. The house was already a carnival of chaos. It was time to pull the curtain. One tap. The music cut out mid-beat. Lights snapped off, plunging the entire mansion into darkness. Screams erupted. Phones lit up the room in frantic flashes. Another tap. The thermostat dropped to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold air roared through the vents. Evan's voice rose above the panic. "Who turned the lights off?" "Alexis. What the hell did you—" He froze. His phone on the table had locked him out of the system. Guest access revoked. Brielle whimpered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Evan, I'm cold. You don't think I know that?" He snapped. I watched the chaos unfold, my heartbeat steady, slow, precise. Outside headlights cut through the window. A truck rolled into the driveway. The leasing company. The live feed caught it perfectly. The tow crew marching up, hooking Evan's SUV and dragging it away, while the guests pressed their faces to the glass, whispering. "What is happening?" Someone shouted. "Bro, is your car getting repoed?" Evan sprinted outside, slipping on the tile in his panic. "Stop, that's my car." "No, sir," the driver said calmly. "It belongs to Hartwell Studio. Primary driver privileges revoked." "I'm the owner," Evan shouted. The man didn't flinch. "Then you should have paid for it." Behind him, Brielle stood barefoot on the porch, wrapping my robe tighter around her body. Cold fog drifted from her mouth with each breath. She whispered, "Evan, everything's falling apart." Inside the house, the smart home system began its final sequence. Every electronic device locked, every door bolted, every alarm armed. Then the audio system crackled to life. Security protocol initiated. Unauthorized access detected. Guests screamed. Someone ran into a locked door. Glass shattered. Panic clawed its way through the room like an animal. Evan stumbled back inside, wild-eyed, sweating despite the cold. He grabbed his phone, tapping furiously, but every attempt was denied. Access restricted. He hurled the phone at the wall. It bounced harmless. My camera caught his face, perfectly rage, confusion, fear twisting together. Then he said it. "She thinks she can do this to me. I own this place. She's nothing without me." He didn't know he was saying it into a microphone directly feeding Jordan's office. I sat back on the hotel bed, folding my hands in my lap. This was the moment I had waited for. The precise second he would dig his own grave deep enough that all I had to do was nod. Sirens echoed faintly through the live feed. Jordan's message appeared. "They're on their way. Don't interfere. He'll bury himself now." And as Evan screamed at the dark, empty house, he thought he controlled a laugh rose in my throat, soft, breathless, colder than anything autumn could offer. Not because I was cruel, but because for the first time in 5 years, I wasn't afraid. The police arrived before Evan could gather whatever dignity he had left. The flashing blue lights bathed the front of Hartwell Estate in an eerie glow, turning the drunken chaos into something almost theatrical. I watched from my hotel window as the officers stepped inside, their voices firm but calm, the kind reserved for situations where the outcome is already certain. I didn't need to be there. The evidence spoke louder than any accusation I could offer. Still, I tracked every moment through the live feed, letting the reality settle over me like a second skin. By the time they escorted Evan out barefoot and shivering, he looked nothing like the man who had threatened me in my own home. His shoulders hunched, his voice cracked, and the confident smirk he used like a weapon was nowhere to be found. Brielle stood in the doorway, mascara streaked down her cheeks, clutching her phone like it was the last lifeline she had. She wasn't crying for him. She was crying because the fantasy evaporated the moment the cuffs snapped shut. Jordan called me once everything was processed. "He's being held overnight," she said. "The fraud charges in Delaware are moving fast, and the DA here wants the recordings." I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, listening to her voice. Calm, efficient, deadly. "What about the post-nup?" I asked. "Void. In fact, it's evidence now," she replied. There was a pause. "Lex, he trapped himself." I looked out at the city, at the blurred lights stretching toward the horizon. "He always would," I said. Jordan hesitated. "There's something else." Derek uncovered an account Evan opened under the alias he used in the fraud case. "It's frozen now, but the balance is substantial." My breath stilled, not in shock but in recognition. Another door opening, another choice to make. "What do you want to do with it?" Jordan asked. I felt a smile, small and sharp, carve its way across my face. Not cruel, just resolute. "I'm not sure yet," I said, "but I know this: they thought they ruined me. They just handed me the one weapon I needed. And for the first time in years, the future felt wide, merciless, and entirely mine. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and still felt alone, if you've ever been dismissed, underestimated, or used by the very person you trusted most, then you already understand pieces of my story. And if you made it this far, you're stronger than you think. Before you go, tell me in the comments what moment hit you the hardest. Share this video with someone who needs to remember their worth. And subscribe if you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family. This story isn't over. Not for me. And definitely not for you.